Hello? Dreamy?
As it came towards us, it went straight up over the top of us, down the other side of the car, and I watched it disappear in the rearview mirror around the corner. Not 20 seconds later, the car just stops running completely.
Now I have actual evidence to show people, and that video being one of them. This is not what we're being led to believe it is. It's something totally different.
The watchers are, in the beginning, they were the ones to watch over. You know, they were the ones to watch, but then they kind of turned.
What I wanted could teach me how to get it.
Yeah.
So to me, like, I want to be a billionaire. So unless you're a billionaire, it ain't really so much you could do to help me. I'm not going to pay you to tell me how to be something that you don't know how to be.
Under the right guidance from a very trained physician, is they can precisely place your own stem cells.
Will be tested to the max.
By yours truly.
That's forestgracing.com.
I'm glad I got access to it, because a lot of y'all don't. Okay, let's just be honest.
The growers we met today, you know, it's the biggest growth piece I've ever seen.
You think it's big enough?
You can.
Yeah.
I mean,
spoke on the state of politics.
It's interesting, but I'm back, baby. Better than ever, and I'm here with NGTV.
The Lost Stetson really, let's go way, way back. Way back prior to Jacob Waltz even coming to Arizona.
What we're going to do with the next installment is we're going to dive into the past a little bit. Phoenix, Arizona wasn't supposed to be the city that we know in present day.
This area has secrets you may not know about. Some consider this land sacred. Others say it's cursed. Phoenix was never meant to be the city you know in present day. It's hidden, surrounded by mountains, and the climate is perfect for military infrastructure. The place you know now was once a prep station for war. It's important to know how Arizona became a major part of Project Bluebook. Let's go back to the early 1940s, where it all began. The major source of income was the 5 C's: cattle, cotton, copper, citrus, and climate. The weather and conditions in Arizona was an attraction to the federal government. That same year, they passed federal grants to build military infrastructures to prepare for war. This created a new industry in Arizona. Modern aviation technology created a new economy for the state in Arizona in 1940. Luke Air Force Base was built and named in the honor of Frank Luke Jr. Frank Luke Jr. was born on May 19, 1897 in Phoenix, Arizona. He was great in sports, participating in bare-knuckle boxing matches and working the copper mines. Harry Truman was born on May 8, 1884 in Lamar, Missouri. In 1890, his parents moved to Independence, Missouri, which had links to the American West and South. This specific town had wagon train tracks that picked up the Oregon and Santa Fe trails, which was the gateway to America's western frontier. In 1917, both men enlisted into World War I. Frank Luke Jr. enlisted and received training as a pilot in Texas and California. Harry Truman became a member of the 129th Artillery Regiment. Both men shipped out to France in March of 1918. Truman and his men saw their first action in the Vosges Mountains. During the late and rainy night of August 29th, artillery shells from the enemy came crashing down on the fear-clad side of the mountain. Word spread that this was a German gas attack. Instead of preparing to fight back, the entire American field was filled with chaos and fear. The soldiers began to flee. The captain at that time became pinned by his horse when a shell exploded less than 20 feet away from him. Truman's bravery and choice of words quickly changed the energy on the field. His leadership was strong. They were so shocked by his actions, the soldiers began to fight back. This was the beginning for Harry Truman on the battlefield. He became the captain of Battery D, 129th Field Artillery. His guidance and ability to lead men was greater than those with higher rankings surrounding him. After his success in the Vosges Mountains, Truman and the division under his command was ordered by the Allied Supreme Command to head to the Argonnes campaign. They basically had to move to the other end of the battle line during very harsh conditions. This march is known as one of the most exhausting in the history of modern warfare. This long journey gave Truman plenty of time to think. During this journey, they lost most of their horses due to poor conditions. Truman at some point even began to doubt himself. The task they were about to face was tough, to say the least. Deep down, Truman knew the job could be done and his soldiers could stand against adversity. On September 26, 1918, the sounds of German artillery got closer and closer. The Americans, led by Harry Truman, set up and they began to fire. For 4 straight hours, over 3,000 rounds were fired. This allowed a head start on foot by American soldiers, which caught the Germans off guard. The satisfaction on Captain Truman's face was evident. He stayed mobile the entire time, visiting different posts over the next 4 days. The 35th Division caused destruction, there's no doubt about that. But they were definitely casualty-ridden. By September 30th, they were pulled off the line, but the artillery element remained. Frank Luke Jr. deployed to France as a second lieutenant. During an 8-day stretch in September of 1918, Frank Luke racked up an impressive 18 victories. He died on September 29th, shortly after taking down 3 German balloons. Because of his bravery, Frank Luke Jr. became the first airman to receive a Medal of Honor awarded to his father in Phoenix in May of 1919. By the early 20s, Truman's service during World War I definitely had future benefits. Being able to lead men under the most trying conditions boosted his self-confidence. The men respected him for his leadership. In Truman's time in the war, the acquaintances and bonds he developed would put him in a perfect position for a political foundation in the Kansas City area. By 1938, Truman had a hand in developing the Civil Aeronautics Act, which laid the foundation for the airline industry over the next 4 decades. Frank Luke Jr. died at the age of 21. 21 years later, Luke Air Force Base was built and named in his honor. By the end of 1940, manufacturing technology for modern aviation brought in $17 million. The ruins of these oxfields can be seen in present day. Before Area 51, hidden deep in the desert, due to the mountain building process, mixture of rugged terrain and flat desert surface, the government strategically placed airfields throughout the area.
I'm not supposed to talk. I've always known I'm not supposed to be talking. I'm not supposed to, and I got to tell you this real quick. I work at really weird.
This is here in the valley?
They look like arrows pointing into the mountains. Luke Air Force Range is adjacent to the United States and Mexico border in the southwestern portion of the U.S. It's more than 1 million acres. In addition, it also has 7,000 miles of airspace.
But I was in Arizona, Phoenix, worked with Luke Air Force Base and Williams when it was still an Air Force Base. In fact, Litchfield was a naval air station in those days instead of what it is today. I'm like, what the fuck is going on? It had me a little freaked out. I almost quit my job for a while, but this guy's such a nice guy. He's part of a, these are old time, government people. I don't know.
What's on public record went as far north as...
So there's a lot of government people there, lots of, old timers. And, gosh, you're going to think I'm nuts when I say this. But anyway, a guy that I dated for a long time from Luke Air Force Base was sent on temporary duty several times for their Bluebook program back in those days. He wasn't allowed to talk about it at all. He probably wasn't even supposed to tell me that's where he was because he was, temporary duty, and usually they weren't supposed to tell you. His name was Alan, A-L-A-N, Katz, K-A-T-Z.
Authorized for day and night use, the range contains 4 controlled man and electronically surfaced attack ranges. In addition, it contains 3 tactical ranges that are several square hundred miles each, that include 2 different full-size mock-ups of airfields. This range also includes the Gila Bend Auxiliary Airfield, which acts as an emergency landing field for all flight crews and pilots that are training on the range.
It's just weird, but this dude changed, right? And he knows I know that he knows I know because I saw you know, he's been in the military and with NASA and all this stuff.
Really observe this geography. Look at the military in these 3 cities. You'll have nearly 20 squadrons that use this range as their backyard. Put all that airspace together, it's larger than the state of Connecticut, which makes it a real training treasure.
I want to say, I think it was in the summertime, because I think it was warm out. My brother and I were driving to work, and then all of a sudden, off in the distance, like the far distance, we could see like a bluish color. I want to say maybe like not even like navy blue, like a lighter blue color. Like the sky just turned, like it went almost like an explosion. Flash on and then just like off it went, and we're like, whoa! I'm like, wow! And my brother's like, did you just see that? I'm like, yeah. What was that? He's like, I don't know. The only thing he said he could think of was he thinks that there's a military base that was out there, and maybe they were, you know, blowing stuff up or explosives or anything with tests. But we never heard anything about it, and from what we heard, nobody else saw it but us.
In Harry Truman's memoirs, he visited summer encampments in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, where he learned the basics of artillery, learned how to handle 6-spirited horses, and drew field guns. A UFO investigator by the name of Leonard Stringfield, who was a former consultant to the UFO operations at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio during the 1950s. He published a story in 1991 on a 1941 UFO crash near Cape Girardeau. This article is in the July of 1991 issue of his status report. A young child by the name of Charlotte Mann, who lived in Cape Girardeau in 1941. Charlotte's grandfather, who was named Reverend Huffman, was a pastor of the Cape's Red Star Baptist Church. She said her grandfather got a call during the spring of 1941 from the police asking him to accompany them to a crash site just outside the city to pray over some victims. Once Reverend Huffman made it to the scene, he noticed personnel of all kinds: police officers, firefighters, FBI agents, emergency medical crews, and numerous military personnel from the Army Air Base near Sykeston. Reverend Huffman then noticed a disc-shaped object in the field. He said he was able to observe the inside of the craft and noticed the interior had metal chairs, controls, and hieroglyphic-like inscriptions. He also witnessed 3 small, non-human bodies dead on the ground. 2 were close to the craft, and the 3rd was some distance away. He described the bodies as small, hairless, big eyes, small mouths, large heads, and small ears. They were about 4 feet in height, didn't appear to have any bone structure, with long arms and fingers. After viewing the bodies, Reverend Huffman was asked to minister over them. Right after he was done, he was taken by military officials and sworn to secrecy. They warned him to never discuss this with anyone. The Reverend was told, "This didn't happen. You didn't see this. This is a matter of national security and is to never be talked about again." Being that there were a lot of people that were at this crash site, the chances of this staying a secret were highly unlikely. Someone would eventually speak. Reverend Huffman had the intentions of keeping the secret. However, he was not successful. A few of the people that learned his secret was his wife Floyd, Charlotte his granddaughter, and his brother, who was the sheriff of Cape Girardeau County, Clarence Schott, who confirmed this story in a sworn affidavit. In addition to the accounts of the UFO crash passed on to her by her grandmother, Charlotte recalled one of the first situations in which she heard about it. Charlotte also recalls seeing a picture that her father had at a dinner party when she was younger. During this dinner party, she heard her father tell this story and remembers bits and pieces of the conversation. Her father was able to obtain a picture from this crash site. In this photo, Charlotte remembers there were two men holding up what appeared to be a non-human body. She gave her best description, as it looked to be about 4 feet tall, and the men were holding the body up from underneath its armpits. UFO researchers have tried to find this photo and have been unable to recover it. UFO journalist BJ Booth says, "The Cape Girardeau story, this case ends like many others, but appears by all indications to be authentic. All who have come in contact with Charlotte Mann have found her to be a trustworthy person who is not given to the sensationalism and has sought no gain from her account. One can reasonably conclude there was a crash event. The implications of this case, if fully proven, are a part of a larger picture. Mainly, extraterrestrial visitors are real, and certain factions of the government have been hiding this since at least 1941. On July 11th, 1941, the Office of Coordinator of Information, which is an intelligence and propaganda agency by Franklin D. Roosevelt. That same week, the Oxfields that are known to the public started on the eastern side of operations. When Higley Airfield was built in July of 1941, the War Department gave approval for construction on land that was really dry and vacant with no irrigation nearby. The early stages of Luke Air Force Range was built on sacred lands south of Phoenix. Higley Airfield was built on native ruins. Why would the government begin preparations of war here in Arizona? And what were they protecting? President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill met in secret to put together an 8-point statement of war aims known as the Atlantic Charter, which would also include a pact that those in this agreement would not accept territorial changes from the war in Europe. This sighting took place in the Indian Ocean on a Polish merchant vessel transporting British troops. Two sailors from the deck of the SS Pulaski reported seeing a strange globe-like object radiating light, that of the color green. This object was about half the size of the moon as it appears to the human eye. They got the attention of the British officer, who also began to watch the movements of this glowing object. All three men observed this sighting for over an hour. Franklin D. Roosevelt gave approval for the atomic program after meeting with Vannevar Bush and VP Henry Wallace. FDR allowed the Army full control because of the large construction projects they had already worked on. This is known as the Manhattan Project. On December 1st, 1941, the United States Public Health Service banned the use of mercury in the felt industry in this country. The mercury miners before 1941 had to deal with mercury poisoning on a daily basis. Suffering from neurological effects, mercury is extremely dangerous. These miners were completely out of it, as if they were on drugs. This is why this area is known as Dreamy Draw. Mercury toxicity affecting the Hatters is a classic example of an occupational hazard, one that was eliminated in 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor. Sunday morning, just before 8 a.m., Pearl Harbor was attacked by 353 Japanese aircraft fighters, including dive, level, and torpedo bombers. They launched from 6 aircraft carriers, damaging 8 U.S. naval battleships. Four of our battleships were sunk. 6 returned to service and went on to fight in the war. One of our battleships suffered catastrophic damages and could not be raised. That ship was the USS Arizona. The men that were on board this battleship are forever entombed there. As the USS Arizona sits, the oil that was on that ship that day when the attack occurred is still rising to the surface. The British government declared war on Japan immediately after learning that their territory had been attacked as well. The attack on Pearl Harbor led to the United States entering World War II the next day. The United States Congress declared war on Japan. The aftermath of Japan's attack was devastating. Harry Truman, who was a senator at this time, would never forget the actions of Japan. The man of war became activated. Franklin D. Roosevelt signs and orders relocation of Japanese Americans. That same month, Higley Airfield was renamed to Williams Airfield. On February 19, 1942, this order authorized the evacuation of all persons deemed a threat to national security from the West Coast to internment camps further inland. In 6 months, 100,000 men, women, and children of Japanese ancestry were moved to relocation centers. They were then evacuated and confined in isolation, fenced, and guarded to places known as internment camps. Most camps, including Gila River, were picked due to their isolated geographic locations, many of which were located in the middle of nowhere. Gila River received incarcerees from Fresno, Sacramento, and Los Angeles. In addition, it took in 2,000 people from the Jerome War Location Center in Arkansas. The Gila River Relocation Center was near the town of Zacatau, about 30 miles southeast of Phoenix. With its highest population of over 13,300 residents, it became the 4th largest city in the state of Arizona.
The news of the world, Wednesday, February 25th. Once again, Columbia.
On the early morning of February 25th, 1942, an object appeared from nowhere out of the southeast.
Ready to give you the latest news direct by shortwave radio. And now for news.
This object flew towards the eastern part of Los Angeles at very high speeds. Whatever this craft may have been, it seems that it left untouched without any loss of casualties. In fact, there were over 1,440 rounds that were fired from anti-aircraft, and not one hit the object. There were multiple eyewitnesses that reported what they saw. Even though it was in the 2 to 3 o'clock hours in the early morning, everybody on the block got up to go see it.
Anti-aircraft guns went into action against unidentified aircraft in the Los Angeles area shortly after 3 a.m. Pacific wartime this morning. The anti-aircraft guns began barking during a blackout ordered by the 4th Interceptor Command at 2:25 a.m. The unidentified object, which some sources thought might be a blimp,
the authorities felt this unknown craft was a Japanese bomber. The craft was fired upon by the guns that were surrounding LA or that were in the city of Los Angeles before this event. the LA metro area had been ready for enemy attacks via planes or bombardment by enemy ships. The term Foo Fighter is another word for UFO at this time. Bogey was the main word that was used to describe vehicles that could not be identified in 1942. The bogey that flew over Los Angeles probably took many hits by anti-aircraft fire, but no visible damage was shown. The craft was seen by thousands of citizens and military personnel.
Casting building in the heart of Hollywood could plainly see the flashes of guns and searchlights sweeping the skies in a wide arc along the coastal area. Concussion of the shells could be felt in downtown Los Angeles, 15 miles away.
After not being able to take down the craft, the military issued statements that the unidentified object was a lost weather balloon, or the people on the ground with the anti-aircraft crews had imagined that they saw an airplane at nighttime.
Although some watchers say they saw airplanes in the air, semi-official sources say they probably were the U.S. Army's pursuit.
The Manhattan Project is underway. At this time, this project was considered extremely top secret. The U.S. didn't want this type of technology in the hands of the enemy. Outside of the development of atomic weapons, this project also gathered intelligence on the German nuclear weapon project. Historians believe this is where the U.S. learned about the Germans' plans of solar technologies and EME. Sometimes, while behind enemy lines, they gathered nuclear materials, documents, and even rounded up German scientists. Even though the Manhattan Project had tight security, Soviet spies successfully penetrated the program. Construction began in May of 1942. The Gila River War Relocation Center was one of 10 internment camps operated by the WRA located throughout the American interior West. The camp was located on the Gila River Indian Reservation near an irrigated agriculture center. It comprised of two separate camps named Canal and Butte. The land for the campsites is owned by the Gila River tribe and is considered sacred by them. They have restricted public access to the historic sites. All the main structures are long gone. Remaining are such elements as the road grid, concrete slab foundations, manholes, cisterns, several rock alignments, and dozens of small ponds. They visited the relocation center to check on the conditions and layout for the Japanese incarcerees. A combat unit was assembled to fight in the European theater during World War II. Some of that combat team came from Arizona. The First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who disagreed with her husband's decision when it came to the internment camps, was given a painting by some of the incarcerees. This painting stayed in her home and up on her walls until her death in 1962. While he was on part of this training facility, he took a tour of some of the ox fields and was briefed on the strategic operations for war. During this visit, FDR learns how big this training range really is. In October of 1943, Nazi Germany successfully uses EME technology. They gained their knowledge on EME technology based off of the UFO crash that happened in Germany in 1937. This UFO crash produced technologies that were reverse engineered. The Germans would try to use these technologies to make contact with otherworldly civilizations. November of 1944, Western Europe. Pilots reported seeing fast-moving, round-glowing objects following their aircraft. These unidentified craft were fiery, glowing red, white, or orange. Some pilots reported that they seemed to toy with the aircraft, making wild turns before vanishing. Reports show that the objects flew in a formation with their aircraft and acted as if they were under intelligent control, never displaying any hostile behaviors. They could not be outmaneuvered. This phenomenon was so widespread, the military took the sighting seriously, suspecting that the mysterious objects to be German secret weapons. Further investigation showed that Japanese and German pilots reported the same sightings. On December 13, 1944, a press release from Paris that was featured in the New York Times officially describing them as the new German weapon. In its January 15, 1945 edition, Time magazine covered a story entitled Foo Fighter. In which it reported that balls of fire had been following the United States Air Force night fighters for over a month. The pilots named it the Foo Fighter, according to the Time. Descriptions of the phenomena varied, but the pilots agreed that the mysterious lights followed their aircraft closely at high speed. The balls of fire phenomenon, reported from the Pacific Theater of Operations, differed somewhat from the Foo Fighters reported from Europe. The balls of fire resembled a large burning spear, which hung in the sky. Though it was reported that sometimes they followed the aircraft. There was speculation that the phenomena could be related to the Japanese fire balloon campaign. When it comes to the European Foo Fighters, no aircraft were reported to have been attacked by a ball of fire.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth frankly and boldly. Nor need we shrink from honestly facing conditions in our country today. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper.
FDR, the 32nd President of the United States, is reelected. Voted in office by the people for a fourth consecutive time. This record will never be broken. In this photo of FDR's cabinet, the public and even some of those around him didn't know his health was rapidly declining. In just one short month, the big three met at the former Russian Tsar's summer palace in Crimea.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
The Yalta Conference was the most important and by far the most controversial of the wartime meetings. Recognizing the strong position that the Soviet army possessed on the ground, Churchill and the allying Roosevelt agreed to a number of compromises with Stalin that allowed the Soviets to remain in Poland and other Eastern European countries. When Roosevelt returned to the United States from the Yalta Conference, many were shocked to see how old and frail he looked. During March of 1945, he sent a strongly worded message to Stalin, accusing him of breaking his Yalta commitments over Poland, Germany, prisoners of war, and other issues. When Stalin accused the Western Allies of plotting behind his back a separate peace with Hitler, Roosevelt replied, "I cannot avoid a feeling of bitter resentment towards your informers, whoever they are, for such vile misrepresentations of my actions or those of my trusted subordinates." On March 29, 1945, Roosevelt went to the Little White House at Warm Springs, Georgia, to rest before his anticipated appearance at the founding conference of the United Nations. In the afternoon of April 12, 1945, in Warm Springs, Georgia, while sitting for a portrait, Roosevelt said, "I have a terrible headache." He then slumped forward in his chair unconscious and was carried into his bedroom. The president's attending cardiologist, Dr. Howard Brune, diagnosed this medical emergency as a massive intracerebral hemorrhage. At 3:35 p.m. that day, Franklin D. Roosevelt died at the age of 63. Harry Truman succeeded Roosevelt as president. The following morning, Roosevelt's body was placed in a flag-draped coffin and loaded onto the presidential train. Thousands flocked to the tracks to pay their respects. Roosevelt's declining physical health had been kept secret from the public. His death was met with shock and grief across the world. As President of the United States, Harry Truman wasted no time to make his presence felt around the world. He learned about some of the secret projects we were working on. After 3 short months in office, we tested the A-bomb. We knew its targets because Truman never forgot about the attack on Pearl Harbor. The United States began to absorb the German technology and scientists that was needed. Was Stalin correct? This was an extremely controversial top-secret program between the United States and Nazi Germany during World War II. Over 1,600 German engineers, scientists, and technicians were removed from Nazi Germany, records wiped clean, given new identities, and placed into high-ranking positions in the United States. This was done because of the advanced military technology and information that the Nazis possessed. We got the EME technology from the Germans. The US also didn't want the Germans to become alliances with the Soviet Union. In the next conference between the big three, the orders were given to drop 2 atomic bombs in Japan. The first atomic bomb is dropped. Truman becomes the first and only world leader to use nuclear weapons in war. The orders are given by the Japanese government, warning the people of Nagasaki to flee immediately. They knew the second bomb was coming, and there was nothing they could do about it. The surrender of Japan was announced on August 15th by Emperor Hirohito. The formal signing of surrender took place on September 2nd, 1945. This surrender was the direct result of the 2 atomic bombs that were dropped in Japan. He learned that the iron fragments from the bombs were being used as shovels. That's when he realized they were in no position for war. We sent a message to our distant neighbors. We use Earth to Moon to Earth technology, also known as EME. EME technology is one that the US absorbed from German scientists during Operation Paperclip after World War II. We successfully bounced radar messages off the moon back to Earth. Project Diana is officially known as the first space project, the origins of NASA, named after the goddess. July 22nd, 1946 marks the birth of the Central Intelligence Group. We continued to use EME technology until we ran into some problems on June 4th, 1946. the largest eruption on the sun took place. NASA learned how powerful unconcentrated energy from the sun actually is. Billions of tons of ionized gas released into space at millions of miles per hour. These bundles of gases make contact with the right spots or the right places on Earth, and they can interrupt technologies. They are considered geomagnetic storms that can damage satellites in space or shut down electrical power grids. The solar wind contains gas that travels through space at speeds of more than 1 million miles per hour. These wind conditions disrupt all technologies. This eruption caused blackouts and technology issues for months. The effects of solar flare can remain within Earth's magnetosphere for weeks or even months. Through EME, NASA began sending messages into different parts of space in hopes of getting a response. And they did. Successful Earth-to-Moon to extraterrestrial contact. This story comes from ex-military personnel from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. In his testimony, he said that he witnessed a recovered flying saucer while he was visiting Building 18, which is now famously known as Hangar 18. This former private of the U.S. Army said he was taking documents to a colleague of his in Building 18. Upon his arrival, the private was asked if he would like to see a very unusual craft in the hangar. He followed his colleague in the storage hangar, and there he saw a circular craft. The craft was about 7 feet in width and about 15 feet in diameter. The colleague told the private that he saw scientists trying to gain entry, but they were unable to. He even spoke of them using a diamond drill, but no success. The two men were able to look inside the craft. They were not able to identify any visible dials, knobs, seats, or any way to control or operate this object. The CIG developed a plan to track all UFO sightings, record them, document accounts, and witness reports. They decided to involve all major newspaper outlets throughout the nation. At the end of 1946, the U.S. government got in contact with all major newspapers throughout the nation, requesting that all UFO sightings to be reported and documented starting the following year. After successfully downing an extraterrestrial craft and knowing what's about to occur in space, NASA and the Central Intelligence Group set forth a plan to capture extraterrestrial vehicles. One of the things that these groups learned was how to track solar storms on the sun. One was due in March. For the next 2 months, NASA and the CIG began sending EME messages into different parts of space. On March 8, 1947, one of the biggest solar storms ever recorded began. Radio communications worldwide were disrupted, and major blackouts occurred.
2 weeks before Roswell. A private pilot by the name of Kenneth Arnold says he saw a string of 9 unidentified flying objects flying past Mount Rainier. Arnold was on a search mission in southern Washington looking for a missing Marine plane. Around 3 p.m. that day, he said he saw 9 extremely bright unidentified flying objects traveling at speeds of at least 1,200 miles per hour. They were at an altitude of about 10,000 feet, and he tracked them from Mount Rainier to Mount Adams. Arnold's description led to the press quickly coining the terms flying saucer and flying disc as popular descriptive terms for UFOs. On July 7, 1947, a 30-year-old Arizona man by the name of William Rhodes took one of the first UFO photos known to man in Phoenix, Arizona. Around 4 p.m., Rhodes was on his way to his workshop in the back of his Phoenix home at 4333 North 14th Street. As a monsoon thunderstorm just ended, he heard the sounds of a jet approaching. He then looked in the sky and didn't see a jet. What he saw was a disc, saucer-like object traveling at fast speeds from the east. The craft spiraled down towards him, and that's when he ran and grabbed his camera and snapped one picture. The craft began to travel upwards. He took another photo. The saucer then disappeared into the clouds. He then went and developed the photos himself. These are the first photos of a flying saucer. Special Agent Aldrich from Williamsfield and Chandler got the photos from the managing editor from the Arizona Republic. In his report, he observed the photos before they went to press. It's known that the Arizona Republic made contact to the special agent before releasing the story. The Williams Road story is published in the Arizona Republic. These photos later went through an authentication process and were proved to be true in nature. Rhodes also mentioned that he was in talks with another civilian who had a set of photos that were taken that same day. The other civilian who took those photos that day, his name was Louis Larmore. Rhodes was cooperative the entire time. He was later visited by 2 agents dressed in black, where they asked for the negatives, and he also turned over his camera, but they were never returned.
This case comes from a man known as Saunders. He lived near the Dreamy Draw area on that side somewhere near northern in the Arizona 51. One day, Saunders was out in the area when he came across a downed flying saucer. He went and observed the disc and the surrounding area and came across two badly damaged non-human bodies not far from the craft. These bodies were about 3 to 4 feet tall with long arms and large heads. Saunders then decided to take the bodies and put them in his meat freezer on his property, contacted government authorities, and made them aware of his discoveries. He held on to the bodies until agents dressed in all black plain clothes showed up. As military personnel began to arrive, they secured the site and removed the bodies from Saunders' meat freezer. While the military was in the area, the development of Cave Creek Road heading northeast was underway. The military activities altered the development of Cave Creek Road, causing the construction to come to a stop. Once the emergency changes were approved, the road took a hard right away from the site of this UFO crash. If you look at Cave Creek Road in present day, you can actually see that the road does bend to the right. In this exact area, there's a massive building that you cannot see from the road, and here it is. It's said that the Dreamy Draw Dam was built to cover up parts of this site and wreckage of the UFO. It's believed that there's an actual UFO under this dam, but that's not true. The Dreamy Draw Dam wasn't built until 1974. It is an executive branch department of the federal government. It supervises all agencies and all aspects of the government directly involved with national security and the U.S. Armed Forces. The national military establishment is under the control of the Secretary of Defense. September 18, 1947 marks the birth of the Central Intelligence Agency. Harry Truman officially takes power from the future presidents by signing the National Security Act. This established the CIA. It operates as a civilian intelligence agency under the executive branch. This act also established a Director of Central Intelligence. This position came with the duties of handling both the CIA and U.S. intelligence activities. Also, under President Truman, he signed the Central Intelligence Agency Act, which allowed the CIA to fund covert operations in secret. Area 51 is a government facility ran by the Central Intelligence Agency. In Jeremy Corbell's film, Bob Lazar, Area 51 and Flying Saucers, Bob Lazar mentions having the Majestic clearance level. Every record involving the Majestic 12 is labeled as false. This topic is extremely controversial. The information contained in these pages is very real. The Majestic 12 has not been publicly acknowledged. Magic Eyes only clearance. The information contained in these pages is very real, but they're labeled as bogus. There are two important events that took place in Harry Truman's life, and both of them took place on the 12th day of the month. The Cape Girardeau crash and being sworn in as president in 1945.
Look at the names on this page. All of these names are real people. These men knew Harry Truman. They had important positions appointed by him or saw the president on a daily basis. Truman is extremely brilliant. These documents also mention the Roswell crash. We know that actually happened. And one of the names on this list had a hand in the cover-up in Roswell. The same documentation also contains information involving the Kenneth Arnold sighting that took place in Washington. This is labeled as bogus. We know that this sighting witnessed by the pilot happened and is authentic in nature. We also know that the photos used from the Rose disc were shown to Kenneth Arnold as a reference to what he saw that day. Moving forward, disclosure and cover-up is a must as we begin to reverse engineer newly discovered technologies. The origins of the Majestic 12 consist of two groups. Each group has 12 individuals that Truman trusted. One group kept a close eye on public government relations, and the second group handled covert operations under the CIA.
I'm like, what the fuck is going on? It had me a little freaked out. I almost quit my job for a while, but this guy's such a nice guy. He's part of these are old time, government people. I don't know.
The photos taken by William Rhodes were authenticated and proven to be real before J. Allen Hynek of Project Bluebook began to discredit Rhodes and his photos. Project Bluebook ended in 1969. That same year, MUFON began. Coincidentally, the last living witness to this next sighting was interviewed by MUFON before he passed. His name was Selman Graves. This UFO story comes in two parts, with multiple witnesses and mentions in two separate books. This story also starts and ends in the Dreamy Draw area. What is it about the Dreamy Draw? The first part of this story comes from the Sunny Slope Museum here in Phoenix. Some wandering prospectors looking for pay dirt in the area witnessed a flying saucer fall from the sky at rapid speeds. It hit one of the mountain peaks, skipped up, and went further north before finding its final resting place.
The Air Force sure didn't fly this thing here.
Legend has it, Selman Graves at the time is 22 years old, along with his 16-year-old brother-in-law, Bob Malone. They were out in the desert rabbit hunting and exploring the mines in the Cave Creek recreational area just north of Phoenix. During their journey, they made it atop a hill and looked west. What they witnessed was something that they would never forget. The pair said they saw a very large metallic silver dome sticking out of the desert floor. It was about 36 feet in diameter, roughly the size of a small house. Graves said that there was no way the Air Force flew this here.
The object, let's see, there were men and there were vehicles. The object was large compared to the size of the house, as far as saying how big it was as a cross and so forth.
At some point, Graves remembers thinking that it might have been some sort of observatory, but then quickly realized an observatory dome wouldn't be so low in elevation.
And it fits. It was approximately 36 feet. We had no idea what we were looking at, and we kicked things around. In fact, this is the first thing that we said was, the Air Force sure didn't fly this thing here. What are they doing? Why wouldn't they do it somewhere else? Maybe it's something, even we thought maybe this is something to do with solar energy collection. It's some sort of a farming, but in any case, there was nothing that made sense of its being there instead of being on one of the bases. We had arrived there at about 10:30 in the morning, and when we left, it was about 10:30 at night. After we had finished looking at the shafts and seeing everything that could be seen, and it was getting late in the afternoon, we returned to Saunders House. We didn't leave there until about 10:30 at night because there were some other men that came on the scene that detained us with various questions and so forth.
Shortly after, he noticed 2 trucks, which later revealed 5 men. They were near the dome. These men were not in uniforms, and they were just observing the craft within touching distance.
Air Force or whatever people you saw, were there any right in the close proximity of the object, or was they?
There were, yes, they were close to it, those that we saw from the hillside, yes.
Okay, so you could say that maybe some were even in touching range or on top of it, or?
In touching range, oh yes.
Okay, all right.
Whatever, this wasn't new that day, that's for sure. They'd had the time to look about, I suppose, feel at ease, but they have this temporary shelter, tent-like building, whatever, put up, and be there with vehicles.
Okay, did you personally see any entities, any bodies at all?
No.
But when you had earlier checked the deep freeze at your...
Oh, well, when Sonia first arrived, he was of considerable concern that we not go near the deep freeze, that it was contaminated and we might get ill from it.
It wasn't until 1952 when Selman Graves realized that he possibly saw the crash site of a UFO because of a book he read called Behind Flying Saucers by Frank Scully. In this book, there was a mention of a down-flying saucer in the Cave Creek area where 2 non-human bodies were recovered from this crash site. There's another mention in a book called Above Top Secret by Timothy Good. On page 394, a man named Pete, who was a miner, worked at a very famous mine known as the Mistress Mine near Seven Springs. He said that he saw government agents in the late 1940s recover and remove wreckage of a flying saucer. The story goes that once this site was all cleaned up, they placed the Cave Creek landfill over the crash site. It's also said that debris, along with dirt from the Cave Creek crash site, was trucked down to the Dreamy Draw. That's 3 crashes in the Dreamy Draw area within 4 months. The William Rose disc happened as Roswell was. Most of you are finding this out for the first time. The Dreamy Draw in 1947 was a hotspot for UFO activity. Exactly 50 years later, the most reported UFO sighting in history flew over the same exact spot. What is it about the Dreamy Draw? They say the Majestic 12 isn't real. There's 12 men seated at this table. There's 12 names on this list. One in particular appears on the list and is also pictured in this photo of Harry Truman's cabinet. That name is James Vincent Forrestal. Under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, Forrestal took the lead on strengthening the Navy. When Truman took office, he became the first U.S. Secretary of Defense. Forrestal was an advocate for racial integration. He was also hostile towards the Soviet Union. After Truman named him Secretary of Defense, the 2 men were often at odds. During private cabinet meetings with Truman, Forrestal appealed to Truman both times. He also argued against the partition of Palestine. Instead, Forrestal favored a federalization plan for Palestine. Because of his actions, President Truman received hate mail and threats to get cut from wealthy campaign contributions. In the only known public statement on this matter, Forrestal stated, "No group in this country should be permitted to influence our policy to the point that it could endanger our national security." Shortly after, Truman forced Forrestal's resignation. James Forrestal's mental health rapidly deteriorated to the point to where he underwent medical care for depression. As a patient at Bethesda Naval Hospital, Forrestal died by suicide from fatal injuries caused by falling out of a 16th-floor window. Dwight Eisenhower agreed with Forrestal's theories on the dangers of the Soviets and the international communist expansion. Eisenhower said this about Forrestal: "James was the one man in the very midst of war, always counseled caution and alertness in dealing with the Soviets. Eisenhower remembered on several occasions while he was Supreme Allied Commander, he had visited with Forrestal, who carefully explained why the communists would never stop trying to destroy all representative government. Eisenhower commented in his personal diary on June 11, 1949, "I never had cause to doubt the accuracy of his judgments on this point." In present day, James Forrestal's name has lived on in pop culture films, plays, television series, video games, operas, and even DC Comics. The commonality between all of them depict his death as a murder and classified as highly suspicious under CIA covert operations. In a game called Area 51, one of the secret documents collected mentions the Majestic 12 by sending a threat by stating receiving the same punishment as his last secretary, Forrestal. It's said that he planned to release information on unidentified flying objects and their origins, advocating the eventual release of information to the public. It's also believed that he was pushed from that hospital window. Some imply that Forrestal, with many others, were labeled as suicides that were really covert operations by the Central Intelligence Agency. All the data and information that was collected from local newspapers and other outlets involving unidentified flying objects and flying saucers throughout 1947 was used to form Project Saucer, which was established by Air Force General Nathan Twining. The primary goal was to gather, understand, and distribute within the government all data relating to UFO sightings. This was eventually succeeded by Project Sign, which was an officially labeled U.S. government study of unidentified flying objects. What you're looking at comes directly from the National Archives, labeled as Aliens in the Archives. Disclosure and cover-up is a must as we begin to reverse engineer newly discovered technologies. Take a look at these photographs with negatives of sightings that were reported as Project Bluebook was active. These videos can also be found in the same section. This video in particular was shot over Luke Air Force Base. It shows an unidentified flying object that appears to be in descent. This video could be evidence of a UFO that was shot down on a DoD training facility. One thing is for certain, our government has been actively taking down unidentified flying objects since 1947. President Truman and his cabinet. President Truman had the future of advanced aviation technology secure. These two groups of men would vote on which future presidents would have clearance to Majestic information. Also, presidents after Truman would only be allowed to serve 2 terms. If you didn't have clearance, you didn't gain access. If they spoke, that president would be replaced. The CIA has cemented its place for the long haul. There was one president that shined light into the depths of secrecy, and he was once the director of the CIA. Let's move to the 90s.